If you had to choose between following the world's expectations or risking everything for something real, what would you do? Hi, I'm Yuna, and I welcome you to Happiness of Love. Get ready for an exciting story that will leave you amazed. Enjoy the video, and may God bless you and your entire family. Have an amazing day. Ethan Monroe stepped steadily out of the helicopter, the breeze lifting his impeccably tailored suit as he ignored his team's compliments. In his hand, a leather folder contained detailed reports on the last hotel in the Monroe Empire. Wasting no time, he pointed with a curt gesture at the manager who was waiting nervously at the entrance. "I need answers before the shareholder meeting tomorrow," Ethan said in a low but sharp voice, his eyes fixed like sharp blades. He liked control, and anything out of place felt like a direct attack on his competence. Meanwhile, many miles away, Grace Parker juggled a stack of books and a tray of cupcakes she had baked for the school book club. Her students ran through the halls, their voices echoing in an excited chaos that she secretly loved. "Grace, are you going to need help with all of this?" asked a friendly janitor, but she smiled and shook her head. "It's okay, I promise I have everything under control," he replied, even as a book threatened to fall from its unstable stack. Her life was like this, full of small challenges that she faced with determination and a constant smile. Their routine couldn't be more opposite. Ethan, in his glass-enclosed office at the top of a skyscraper, surrounded by figures and graphs, lived in a world where mistakes were not allowed. Grace, in the small public schoolroom, surrounded by children's drawings and worn pictures, saw in her students' small mistakes the opportunity to teach them how to grow. Ethan finished his presentation with precision, barely noticing the phone vibrating insistently on the table. It was a call from his grandfather, Henry Monroe, a name that carried weight but ultimately more irritation than inspiration. Henry had been insisting on issues that Ethan preferred to ignore: emotional responsibilities, personal life, and the company's succession. When he finally answered, Henry's husky voice filled the line with authority. "You need to understand, Ethan, that the Monroe legacy is not just brick and mortar. Are you ready to come see me now?" Ethan sighed, looking out the window at the vastness of the city that seemed to bend to his will. Henry's tone made it clear that the meeting was not optional. Meanwhile, Grace was in the cafeteria, overseeing a line of hungry children. "Did you bring us these cupcakes, Miss Parker?" asked a student, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Of course you do, Lily," Grace responded enthusiastically, bending down to the girl's level. "But only if you promise to eat your vegetables first." At that moment, the school bell rang, and Grace felt the familiar turmoil in her chest, a day full of commitments, but with her heart satisfied with each one of them. On the one hand, sterile luxury and corporate pressures, on the other, the cozy simplicity and human warmth. Two worlds about to collide, still oblivious to the inevitability of the encounter that would change their lives forever. Henry Monroe watched the lines of his aging hand, each groove telling stories he knew he no longer had time to tell. The cold light of the hospital room fell on the white sheets, but his mind was far away, lost among memories and plans for the future. He adjusted his glasses on his nose and looked at the door, waiting for Ethan, his grandson and only heir, who had finally accepted his insistent invitation. Ethan entered the room with his usual controlled expression, but his eyes betrayed his discomfort. The vision of his grandfather, once a giant in his mind, now seemed reduced to the fragility of an ordinary man. "How are you?" Ethan asked, the words coming out more formal than he intended. Henry didn't waste time with superficial answers. "Sit down, boy, we have a lot to talk about," he said with a tone that brooked no objections. The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan settled into the chair beside the bed, his fingers drumming against the arm. He hated the air of urgency that Henry exuded, as if every word was a disguised goodbye. When Henry finally spoke, his words fell like hammers. "You know it's not just about numbers and contracts, Ethan. This empire is a responsibility, and I need to make sure you are prepared to lead it." Ethan rolled his eyes. "I've heard that speech before, Grandpa. If this is for another lecture on commitment." Henry interrupted, his tone becoming more serious. "It's not a lecture, Ethan. It's a condition. The will requires you to be in a stable, committed relationship to inherit Monroe Enterprises." The words hung in the air, and Ethan felt heat rise in his throat. "What? You've got to be kidding. This is absurd." Ethan responded, his voice thick with disbelief and anger. "No joke," Henry replied, his eyes fixed on his grandsons. "This company needs a leader who understands the importance of values beyond profits." Ethan's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Do you think a fake relationship will make me a better man? This is emotional blackmail." Henry gave a tired smile. "Maybe it is. But it is also an opportunity." Meanwhile, across town, Grace sat in a small cafe, reviewing papers and trying to balance her personal budget with the rising costs of school supplies. The doorbell rang, and an elegant man entered, his presence seeming out of place in such a simple place. He approached Grace, introducing himself as Henry Monroe's lawyer. Grace was taken aback when he explained the reason for his visit. "Mr. Monroe was deeply impressed by your kindness and dedication to the community," the lawyer began, as she frowned, trying to understand where this was going. "He wants to make a generous donation to his school, but there is one condition." Grace listened in silence, her heart racing as the words "fake relationship" were uttered. "I don't understand." "Why me?" he asked, his voice hesitant but with an underlying tone of determination. The lawyer adjusted his jacket before answering. "Mr. Monroe believes his influence can be positive for Mr. Ethan." Grace fell silent, her mind reeling with the improbability of the situation. She knew that money could transform lives, but the idea of engaging in something so artificial and uncomfortable felt like a betrayal of her own values. However, the lawyer was clear: without his acceptance, the donation would be unfeasible. The next day, Ethan and Grace met for the first time in the meeting room of one of the Monroe hotels. The ambience was luxurious, with modern furniture and windows that offered a stunning view of the city, but the discomfort between them filled the space more than any decor. "So you're that teacher who's going to save my inheritance?" Ethan snapped, crossing his arms. Grace lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "And you're the spoiled heir who thinks you can solve everything with money?" The lawyer interrupted, trying to diffuse the tension. "Both have something to gain from this. It's a mutually beneficial situation." Ethan and Grace exchanged sharp looks, but eventually they both signed the contract, their signatures marking the beginning of a journey full of resistance and inevitable transformations. The sound of the crystal glass clinking against the edge of the table echoed in the luxurious dining room, where the Monroe family was gathered for a charity event. Ethan was the center of attention, his presence domineering, while Grace, at his side, maintained a polite smile that hid her discomfort. He held her waist with a choreographed lightness, as if he were holding a prop. She, in turn, felt every muscle tense, struggling to maintain her composure as she was introduced as the special woman in Ethan's life. "Is this as fake as it sounds, Ethan?" Grace muttered through her teeth as she waved at a passing couple. He responded without moving his lips, with a fake smile plastered on his face. "Just follow the script, Grace. Let's not turn this into a soap opera scene." Grace looked at him, trying to ignore her growing irritation. Ethan was everything she despised in a man: arrogant, insensitive, and used to using people as tools. But there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't define. Maybe tiredness? Or just the frustration of having to pretend to care? After 2 hours of superficial interactions and an endless parade of forced smiles, Grace couldn't hold it in any longer. When they had a moment alone on the terrace, she turned to Ethan, her patience at its limit. "This won't work if you keep treating me like a personal assistant. Can you at least pretend I'm a real person?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. Sorry, I forgot that you are the woman who came with a contract, not an identity of her own." His voice had an acidic tone, but there was something else there, perhaps a small spark of guilt? Grace took a deep breath, trying not to let her anger get the better of her. "You don't know anything about me. I only accepted this because your conditions could help children who need support. But, of course, you can only see the world through the prism of your ego, right?" He was silent for a moment, the night wind rustling the light curtains behind them. Then finally he replied, his voice less sharp than before. "And you think you know everything about me, Grace? Do you think it's easy to live with every person around me expecting me to be perfect?" The almost imperceptible confession left Grace speechless. For the first time, she saw something beyond Ethan's cold facade, a glimmer of vulnerability. But before he could respond, the terrace door opened, and Henry's voice echoed. "Ethan, Grace, come. We are waiting for you for the family photo." In the following days, forced coexistence intensified tensions. They rehearsed speeches for meetings and attended dinners where they had to act like a couple in love. Each touch, a quick hug, one hand resting on the other, seemed mechanical, but Grace began to notice small details that contradicted Ethan's arrogance. He was attentive to subtleties in a conversation, knew how to deal with crises and events with impressive calm and, even without meaning to, was protective in uncomfortable situations. In contrast, Ethan was also beginning to see Grace beyond her obvious kindness. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and had a courage that he found challenging but admirable. Despite their differences, he couldn't ignore the fact that, as annoying as it was, Grace was the real deal. Something rare in your world of superficiality. Conflicts were inevitable. Like when Ethan complained about Grace's insistence on greeting the staff at a hotel they visited together. "You need to stop caring so much about what people you'll never see again think," he said impatiently. Grace, however, retorted firmly. "And you need to start seeing people as more than tools for your goals." The contract seemed like a burden, but they both knew they were trapped in this act. Each interaction felt like a complicated dance between resistance and discovery, and even though neither was willing to admit it, the impact of their opposing personalities was beginning to be felt. In the Monroe Foundation meeting room, Ethan Monroe leafed through reports with surgical precision. His expression was impenetrable, but each page he turned seemed to weigh more than the last. Beside him, Grace Parker tried to maintain her composure. That night's charity event would be the biggest the foundation had ever organized, and as part of the contract, they needed to perform together, as a perfect couple. Ethan, however, seemed distant, absorbed in his own thoughts. "Do you always carry this tension on your shoulders?" Grace asked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't look at her, just murmured, "Only when I have to deal with situations like this." She felt the irony in his words, but also something else, an exhaustion that he hid well. Night arrived, and the Hotel Monroe's event hall was impeccable. Crystal chandeliers cast golden sparkles over tables decorated with exotic flowers and menus that exuded luxury. Grace wore a simple yet elegant dress that contrasted with the ostentation around her. Ethan, on the other hand, looked at ease in his tailored suit, navigating among the guests with a calculated smile. But as the night wore on, Grace began to notice something she hadn't seen before. Ethan moved with mechanical perfection, as if he were part of a grand show he didn't choose to star in. Between the empty praises and superficial conversations, she noticed the demanding looks from Ethan's family, especially his Aunt Margaret, who led the company's board. "Do you still think he is the ideal heir?" Margaret whispered to one of the directors as she passed Grace, clearly intending to be heard. Grace felt the impact of the words as if they were directed at her. Later that night, on the hotel terrace, Grace found Ethan alone, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and his gaze lost in the cityscape. He looked different, vulnerable. "I didn't know you needed morale boosting to face your own family," Grace said, trying to sound light, but her voice carried sincere concern. He laughed, but without humor. "That's all they do. They test me, they judge me. For them, I will never be good enough." Grace hesitated before answering, feeling that there was a rare chance to catch up with him. "They can think whatever they want. But from what I've seen, you carry more weight than anyone here. And somehow, you remain strong." Ethan turned to her, surprised by the honesty of her words. For a moment, he wanted to believe what she said, but his usual cynicism won out. "You don't know me well enough to say that." Grace met his gaze, firm and defiant. "And maybe that's why I see things they don't." The next day, while Ethan was immersed in a meeting, Grace returned to her school routine. However, his return was anything but smooth. Some fellow teachers greeted her with cold smiles, and the principal called her in for a chat. "Grace, there's been talk about your association with the Monroe family. Some parents think this can distract you from your responsibilities here." Grace felt a surge of indignation, but took a deep breath before responding. "My priority will always be this school and these children. If there are concerns, I prefer to address them directly." The situation hit her harder than she expected. Later, when talking to one of her closest friends, she opened up. "It seems that suddenly I am judged not by what I do, but by who they think I am." The friend, however, reminded her of something important. "Grace, you will always be criticized for things people don't understand. But that doesn't erase the positive impact you have here." Meanwhile, Ethan received a call from his Aunt Margaret. She implied that his relationship with Grace was too convenient to be real, and that he should reconsider his priorities. The insinuation made him furious, but it also made him reflect. For the first time, he wondered if the contract with Grace was really just an act. Over the weekend, Ethan accompanied Grace to a community event. He watched her interact with children and adults with a naturalness he had never been able to replicate. She was genuine, approachable, and made those around her feel important. When a boy hugged her, saying, "Thank you, Miss Parker, for helping me with my homework," Ethan felt something he hadn't expected: admiration. For the first time, he wondered if there was something missing in his own life, something that money and status could never buy. In the quiet of Ethan's office, only the soft chime of the clock kept time. He was sitting in his leather armchair, his face illuminated by the bluish light of his laptop. Detailed reports were open on the screen, but he couldn't focus. What occupied his mind was a recent conversation with his lawyer, something he couldn't shake. "The will has a hidden clause, Mr. Monroe. It seems your grandfather may have intentions beyond the obvious." Ethan closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. He felt manipulated, used in a game whose rules he barely understood. Henry was many things, but he wasn't often dishonest. Why now? And why involve Grace in this? When he thought about her, a new wave of emotions arose: irritation, confusion, and, most of all, a vulnerability that he hated. Meanwhile, Grace sat in the living room of her small house, her mind equally restless. On the table in front of him, a shiny invitation to the next Monroe family event seemed to mock his insecurities. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that this was all just a temporary obligation, but with each encounter with Ethan, she felt an invisible barrier dissolve. The problem was that she didn't know if this was a good thing or a dangerous thing. The next morning, the two were in the car together on the way to a charity event organized by Monroe Enterprises. The silence between them was thick. Grace stared out the window, trying to ignore Ethan's presence as he focused on the road, his fingers tight on the steering wheel. "You seem quieter today," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Grace looked at him, surprised by his attempt at conversation. "I'm just thinking," he replied vaguely, not knowing if he should admit what was really going through his head. Ethan hesitated before asking, "Thinking about what?" She stared at him for a moment before responding, her voice thick with honesty. "Wondering if I really belong in this world." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You are the most genuine person I have ever seen, Grace. If anyone belongs anywhere, it's you." She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "That's not true, Ethan. I have nothing to do with luxury, status and," she gestured to the car that surrounded them, "and all the rest." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, but he didn't know what to say. He had never questioned what was part of his world, but somehow, Grace's words got to him. At the event, Grace felt out of place among the well-dressed people and sophisticated conversations that seemed out of touch with her reality. But as she smiled and tried to blend in, she noticed Ethan watching her. He looked worried, as if trying to understand what she was feeling. When the night ended, they were left behind, alone in the empty hall. Ethan, for the first time, approached her without his usual air of superiority. "Grace, why did you actually agree to do this?" She was silent for a moment before responding, her voice soft but firm. "I did this for the kids at my school. Because I knew this donation could change lives." "And why are you still here?" he pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, feeling her heart race. "I don't know, Ethan. Maybe I'm hoping to discover something that makes this worthwhile." The words hung in the air, loaded with a meaning that they both tried to ignore. Ethan, his heart racing, felt an impulse he couldn't explain. But before he could act, Grace took a step back, breaking the connection that seemed to have formed between them. Later that night, Ethan reviewed documents in his grandfather's office. Among the papers, he found something that made him freeze, a letter written by Henry. He opened it with shaking hands, reading the words that seemed to echo his own thoughts. "Ethan, if you're reading this, maybe I'm not here anymore. I want you to know that everything I did was thinking about what was best for you and this empire. But what really matters is not the money, but the connections you make. I hope Grace helps you understand this." He felt a lump in his throat. Henry's manipulation had clear intent, but it only increased his frustration. He didn't know if he was being led into something real or just another power play. The day began with a cloudy sky, as if the universe was reflecting the weight on Ethan and Grace's minds. The call from the hospital came early, interrupting breakfast. Henry Monroe had suffered a relapse in his health and was hospitalized in critical condition. Ethan set down his coffee cup, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. The journey to the hospital was made in silence. Grace, sitting on the next bench, watched Ethan's face. He looked more human than ever, his distant gaze, clenched jaw and fingers drumming on the steering wheel revealed his struggle to maintain control. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but she didn't know how to break the barrier he still kept between them. At the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the rhythmic sound of machines filled the atmosphere. Ethan entered Henry's room, and Grace waited outside, giving them privacy. The grandfather was pale, his always imposing figure now seemed small between the white sheets. Ethan approached, his voice shaking. "Grandpa, why didn't you ever tell me how bad it was getting?" Henry opened his eyes with difficulty, but a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Because you would have dropped everything and come running, and I don't want your pity." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, but what came next took him by surprise. "Ethan, I knew you would never get out of this bubble alone. The plan with Grace wasn't just for you to inherit the company. It was for you to learn to connect, to love." Henry's words hit Ethan like a blow. He shook his head, trying to understand. "Are you telling me you manipulated all of this just to teach me a life lesson?" Henry held his hand, his eyes locked on Ethan's. "There is more to life than business, my grandson. I needed to make sure you knew this before I left." Later, Ethan left the room with heavy shoulders, each step feeling more difficult than the last. Grace was waiting for him in the hallway, standing up immediately when she saw him. He looked at her, his face a mix of anger, frustration, and confusion. "Let's get out of here," he said, almost in a whisper. In the car, as they drove home, the silence was almost suffocating. Ethan finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "He planned everything. This contract, you? It was all part of a game to change me." Grace felt the impact of the words, but tried to remain calm. "Do you think I knew that?" "Ethan, I was taken by surprise too." He looked at her quickly, his eyes searching for something he couldn't express. But why did you stay? Why did you accept? Grace took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I stayed because I started to see something in you that was worth it. But now, she hesitated, her heart racing. Now I don't know if you see me as I really am or just as part of this plan. Ethan stopped the car abruptly at the edge of a park. He left without saying anything, and Grace, hesitating, followed him. They walked in silence for a few minutes, until he finally turned to her. Grace, I don't know what's real anymore. Everything in my life has always been a game, a strategy. But with you? He stopped, the words stuck in his throat. I don't know what to do with this. She felt tears threatening, but she didn't let them fall. Ethan, you need to figure this out for yourself. I cannot be the answer to your questions. The moment seemed endless, emotions fluctuating between them like a storm about to break. Then, on an unexpected impulse, Ethan stepped forward and grabbed Grace's hands. I want to try, Grace. I want to find out what that means. She looked at him, her heart torn between hope and fear. But before he could respond, a voice from a telephone interrupted them. It was the hospital. Henry had asked to see them again. Back at the hospital, Henry looked weaker, but still carried that knowing look that Ethan knew so well. He held both of their hands, a tired smile on his face. Don't lose what you have. It's rare, and I would do it all over again if I had to. Grace felt the tears fall, but Ethan just pursed his lips, taking in every word. When they left the room, Ethan finally looked at her more clearly, as if seeing something for the first time. Maybe he was ready to change. Or maybe it was just the beginning. Grace Parker was at school mid-afternoon, rearranging papers for her next student project, when an unexpected message appeared on her cell phone. It was from the Monroe family's lawyer, asking to meet with her to discuss details about the will. Curiosity was soon replaced by growing restlessness. Why would he be talking to her and not Ethan? In the small meeting room of the foundation's office, the lawyer received her with a diplomatic but distant look. He handed her an envelope containing copies of an additional clause from Henry Monroe's will. Grace read the words carefully, and her face paled with each line. Even if the relationship between Ethan Monroe and Grace Parker is not maintained, the donation to the Parker School will be made in full. She felt a surge of anger and humiliation. For weeks, she had believed she was making personal sacrifices to protect her students' futures. Now, I discovered that all that theater was unnecessary. She walked steadily to Ethan's office, the envelope clutched in her hand. Ethan, we have to talk. His voice was sharp, full of contained emotions. He looked up in surprise, but upon seeing her expression, he realized something was wrong. Grace, what happened? She threw the envelope on his desk, anger finally boiling over. This happened. Did you know that? That it didn't matter if we went through with this deal or not, my school would get the money? Ethan took the papers, confusion quickly turning into shock. No. I didn't know. Henry never told me about that clause. Grace crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. But how can I believe you, Ethan? This has all been a manipulation from the beginning. I wonder if you ever saw me as more than a pawn in your grandfather's plan. He felt a tightness in his chest. Grace, I swear I didn't know that. He set the papers aside and stood up, his eyes fixed on hers. And what about you? Do you really think everything that happened between us was a hoax? Grace hesitated, the intensity of his words piercing her indignation. Ethan continued, his voice softer but full of urgency. I know I'm not perfect. And maybe I started this without understanding what was going on. But now, he paused, taking a deep breath. Now I know that you mean more to me than any contract or inheritance. She felt her heart waver, but the wound was still deep. Ethan, this isn't just about you. It's about the fact that I was used by your family. How can I trust someone who put me in this position? Before Ethan could respond, the door opened abruptly. Margaret, Ethan's aunt, entered unannounced, her expression full of disdain. I see you're having an interesting conversation. Margaret completely ignored Grace and addressed Ethan. That's exactly what I was saying, Ethan. This woman does not belong in our world. Grace felt the blow, but didn't let it show. Ethan, however, lost his temper. Margaret, that's enough. I won't hear another word about it. Margaret laughed coldly. Do you think you can protect her? This isn't about love, Ethan. It's about business. You should know this better than anyone. But he didn't back down. Maybe that's why this is all wrong. I've spent my whole life putting business above everything else. But Grace showed me that there is something more important. Margaret shrugged and left, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Ethan turned to Grace, his expression now more vulnerable than ever. Grace, I want you to know that even if it ends here, what I feel for you is real. She looked at him, tears finally welling up. Ethan, this isn't easy for me. I need time to understand all of this. He nodded, respecting her decision. I hope you find the answer you are looking for. That night, Grace walked through the park, Ethan's words echoing in her mind. She was torn between the desire to believe him and the fear that it was all just another layer of manipulation. But something in his eyes, in his voice, made her want to believe. Ethan, meanwhile, was alone in his penthouse, looking down at the city below. For the first time, he became aware of the emptiness that surrounded him. He knew he couldn't lose Grace, but he also knew he needed to prove himself in a way she could trust. Ethan Monroe stood in the great hall of the family mansion, surrounded by familiar faces who seemed more like adversaries than allies. Margaret, his aunt, led the charge with her cutting tone. "Ethan, you're risking everything for a woman who clearly doesn't understand what it means to be part of something as big as the Monroes." He took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of years of family expectations weigh on his shoulders. All his life, he had molded himself into what was expected of him, the perfect heir, the ruthless businessman, the face of the Monroe dynasty. But now, the thought of losing Grace made all the trophies and titles seem insignificant. "Margaret, this is not what Grace understands. It's about what I want. For the first time, I'm choosing what is right for me, not what is convenient for the company." The room was silent, the evident shock in the faces of family members. Margaret tried to argue again, but Ethan lifted his hand, ending the discussion. "If you think you can control me with threats or blackmail, you are wrong. If that means I have to give up the empire to have what really matters, I'm willing." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she realized she couldn't beat him at that moment. The family dispersed, leaving Ethan alone in the huge hall. He looked around, feeling a mixture of relief and empty. As much as he was willing to fight for Grace, the reality of losing his connection with his family was still painful. Meanwhile, Grace was sitting on her small balcony, watching the city's lights at a distance. She held the invitation to Monroe Enterprises' next charity event, but couldn't decide if she should go. Since his last conversation with Ethan, his thoughts had become a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew Ethan was more than the arrogant facade she showed to the world. He had shown vulnerability, something no man in his circle seemed to allow. But she also knew that loving someone like Ethan meant accepting a world that wasn't hers, a world of expectations, intrigue, and sacrifices. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. When he opened, he found Ethan stopped there, his hands in his pockets, his eyes full of something between anxiety and determination. "Grace, I needed to see you." She let him in, closing the door behind her. Ethan seemed different that night, more human, more present. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Grace, I had a discussion with my family. I told them that I am willing to give up everything if that is what I need to do to go my own way." She was silent, her emotions bubbling under the surface. "Why would you do that?" He stepped forward, his voice firm, but loaded with emotion. "Because none of this is worth it without you. I know I was wrong, that I was dragged by a plan that I should never have involved you. But what I feel now has nothing to do with Henry, or the will. It's about you, Grace. About how you make me want to be better." His words hit her like a wave, breaking the barriers she had built to protect her heart. But even so, the fear still hovered. "Ethan, I don't know if I can fit into your world." He held his hands, his fixed eyes on hers. "I don't want you to fit, Grace. I want to create a world where we can both be who we are together." She felt the tears formed, but this time, she didn't fight them. There was something in his eyes, a sincerity that could not be pretended, a love she never imagined she would find. That night Grace decided to risk it. She knew that loving Ethan meant facing challenges, but also meant finding something real, something she couldn't ignore. They spent hours talking, laughing, sharing fears and hopes. For the first time, the weight of the contract disappeared, replaced by a genuine connection. Ethan left Grace's house feeling lighter but determined. He knew there were still battles to be faced with his family, with the world, but with Grace beside him, he was ready for anything. The sound of steps echoed in the meeting room of the Monroe skyscraper. Ethan was standing at the head of the long glass table, staring at the board members. His eyes were firm, but there was something different in him, a serenity that came from his new certainty. The morning was clear, and the light crossed the windows, illuminating the environment, as reflected the clarity of its decision. "Gentlemen," he said, with a calm voice, but full of authority. "Today, we will discuss the future of Monroe Enterprises. And this time it will be under my terms." The room was silent, the confused and curious eyes. Margaret was there, of course, with her arms crossed, ready for any sign of weakness. Ethan continued. "For years, I let expectations guide me, but I realized that leading this company needs to be more than numbers and power. Monroe Enterprises will be an example of innovation and responsibility, but also of balance." The murmurs started. Ethan knew this would not be easy. He was reformulating the rules of an empire that had been built on strict traditions. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Ethan, are you sure this approach is not being influenced by personal circumstances?" He looked up at her without dodging. "Yes, Margaret. My choices are now personal, because I realize that this is how it should be led, on purpose, not just pragmatism." Meanwhile, Grace was at school, teaching students about American history. His voice was firm, but his mind was restless. Since decided to give Ethan a chance, the external pressure seemed to have increased. Some colleagues still looked at her differently, as if she had done something wrong with accepting her position beside him. During the break, the director called her to a meeting. "Grace," the woman said, her serious expression. "I have heard comments, but I want you to know that we fully trust your dedication to students." Grace nodded, grateful, but at the same time frustrated. No matter what to do, there would always be someone doubting their ability. But then he remembered Ethan, how he was also struggling to stay true to himself in a world that tried to shape him. At the end of the day, while organizing papers on his table, he received a message from Ethan. "I need you at the foundation event tonight. It's important." She hesitated, but replied that she would be there. The event was in the main hall of the Monroe Hotel, lit with a golden shine, where glamour seemed to be in every detail. Grace arrived in a simple but elegant dress, and was immediately noticed. Whispers echoed around, but she raised her chin, determined not to be intimidated. Ethan was waiting for her near the stage. When he saw her, he smiled, and at that moment, Grace realized something that filled her with strength. He was the same Ethan she knew, even in all the luxury and ostentation. While the event advanced, Ethan took the stage for a speech. He started talking about the Foundation's mission, but soon his voice took a more personal tone. "Tonight, I want to talk about changes. About how to grow. It does not mean abandoning who you are, but finding a way to integrate all aspects of your life." He looked at Grace, his voice softening. "This company, this foundation, my life. All this only makes sense because I found something that showed me what really matters." Grace felt her eyes worse, but smiled, knowing that those words were both for her and the other gifts. At the end of the night, as they walked through the hotel garden, Ethan held Grace's hand. "Thank you for being by my side today. I know it's not easy for you." She looked at him, with a mixture of affection and determination. "It's not easy, Ethan, but you showed me it's worth it. And I found that I can be part of your world without losing who I am." He stopped and turned to her, the intensity in his eyes stealing her breath. "Grace, you taught me more than any book or mentor. You showed me that I don't need to carry everything alone." She smiled, touching his face gently. "And you showed me that it is possible to dream big without forgetting the little things." The soft sound of the piano filled the small church in the heart of the city where Grace had grown. The wooden beams gleamed under the hot shine of the sunlight, filtered by the colorful stained glass windows. The flowers that adorned the altar were harvested by the school students where Grace taught, a simple but significant contribution to the moment that symbolized more than one union, symbolized two worlds meeting and accepted. Ethan was standing on the altar, his dark gray suit impeccably adjusted, but his eyes could not hide the emotion he overflowed. He had never felt so exposed and at the same time so complete. When Grace entered the church door, wearing a delicate lace dress that seemed to have been made for her, he felt his breath disappear. Grace looked at him, feeling the heartbeat accelerate. At that moment she saw more than the heir to an empire. He saw the man who had learned to love, with all his failures, all his struggles and all his growth. Every step towards him was a statement that he was exactly where he should be. When she arrived at the altar, Ethan held her hand, squeezing her slightly. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his voice broken by an emotion that he rarely showed. The Reverend began the ceremony, his words echoing with simplicity and depth. But it was the looks that Grace and Ethan exchanged that told the true story, a story of sacrifices, discoveries, and love that surpassed the barriers of two such different worlds. When the Reverend declared that they were now husband and wife, the sound of the applause was drowned out of the kiss they shared, a moment that seemed to seal not just a commitment, but a new beginning. The reception took place outdoors in the school garden. The tables were arranged simply, decorated with small arrangements made by the children. Laughter and joy filled the air, while Ethan, for the first time in his life, was completely comfortable in an environment that he had previously considered modest. Grace watched him interact with his students, the parents and the community she loved so much. He looked different, looser, more real. That was Ethan she knew. She had always existed under her arrogance and control armor. Meanwhile, a group of Monroe Foundation colleagues was gathered at a nearby table, muttering with each other. Margaret was there, but this time, her countenance was neutral. She had lost the battle, but seeing Ethan so happy, perhaps she had begun to understand that the Monroe legacy was bigger than she imagined. That same week, Grace received an official letter from the foundation. The donation to the school had been approved and doubled in value. In the envelope, there was a written note by Ethan's hand, "For you to keep changing lives, as mine has changed." Grace felt his eyes mirate as he read the words. It was a reminder that even in a world of luxury and power, genuine gestures could still prevail. Shortly thereafter, Henry Monroe passed away. His last act was to transfer part of his heritage to social causes, something that surprised even the most conservative members of the family. In the funeral, Ethan spoke about the man who had shaped so much of his life, but also the man who in his last years had challenged him to be more than he himself believed to be. Grace was beside him all the time, his presence like an anchor. She knew Henry was not perfect, but she also knew that her intention to teach Ethan the importance of human connections had been sincere. Months later, Ethan and Grace were at home, a smaller but welcoming property where he planted the first tree in the garden. Grace watched him out the window, feeling the warmth of a life they had begun to build together. "Do you think she will grow well here?" Ethan asked, looking at Grace with a smile. "With the right care, she will thrive," Grace answered, her voice full of meaning. As the sun was put on a golden light on them, Grace and Ethan sat on the boulder of the porch, their hands intertwined. The world around was still full of challenges, but at that moment everything seemed possible. Our story for today comes to an end, friends, but before we say goodbye, I need your help to keep this rhythm of stories alive. If this story moved, inspired, or simply entertained you, don't hesitate to give this video a like. It's as simple as a click, but it means the world to us. Do you want more stories like this one? Then subscribe to Happiness of Love and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any of our new adventures. Remember, we have a new video every 2 days. Share this video with your friends and family, who knows? You might inspire someone to make a positive change in the world. Leave us a comment letting us know which part of the story touched your heart the most. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. And if you're watching this on your phone, don't forget to hit the hype button to show your enthusiasm and help us reach even more people with these inspiring stories. Thank you for being part of the Happiness of Love community. Your support is like the heartbeat of this channel, vital and full of life. Oh, and before you go, check out the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another amazing story you won't want to miss. See you in 2 days with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, keep the rhythm of love and inspiration alive, one beat at a time.